Hi, I'm Linda, and this is No Frills ASMR. I thought today we could talk about the Mercury 13. So last night I was climbing into bed and went onto YouTube and I saw a comment from a person whose name was Bug. It was Bug in some number, but it was Bug. And that commenter said, could you do a video on the Mercury 13? And my initial reaction was, oh, I already did that. I did the Radium Girls. But I was thinking they were Mercury. I don't know. Because I also did a Mad Hatter one about Mercury. So I was kind of confused. So I went and grabbed that link. And then when I went back, I was like, oh, wait a minute. This is different. And I looked it up and realized I don't know anything about it. So, I love that. I love that. So, this morning, I have spent some time researching the Mercury 13, and I just thought I'd try to share what I've learned. Now, I'm no expert. I've spent the morning looking it up and trying to understand it, and I think I have a lot of good information. But if you're really interested, I can recommend there is a Netflix documentary. I think it's called The Mercury 13. And I think that would be really worth a watch if you're interested. But I will share with you a little bit just to get your, I want to say beak wet, but that always sounds weird to me. I don't know. But I don't think it is weird. It's just like the bird, Anyway, and I have here the moon globe because what we're talking about actually has to do with space. So I'm not exactly sure what order I will explain this, but let's just start. We'll go back to the 1950s. So in around, let me get a piece of paper, around in 1957, in the US, the space race begins. And a part of that is because Russia has sent up Sputnik, and they've started to send up animals into space. And the US is like, yo, we gotta catch up with Russia. Can't have that. So this is sort of the beginnings of the space race. In 1958, the US starts what is called Project Mercury. And this is a project to get men astronauts ready to go to space. Okay, so we have that. Now, before all this was World War II. And during World War II, most men who could fly were in Europe or Asia flying, in the war. Women were not allowed to do that. However, they were allowed to be part of the Women's Air Force Service pilot group. And so they would fly all the same planes. They learned how to fly all of them. And they would service them or train other pilots. They'd train men, in how to fly them to go off to war. And they did a lot. They did a lot during that time. But after the war, when all the men came home, they basically said, we don't need you gals here anymore. Well, they still wanted to fly because these are women who, before the war, were flying like crop dusters. And, a lot of farm people had small planes that they could fly. And so it was, their life work to fly. And then once they got to fly these Air Force planes, they were like, I don't want to go back, but at that time, women weren't allowed to be pilots for commercial flights. They weren't allowed to be part of the military once the men were home. That's not true. They were still, but not trained as fighter pilots or anything like that. So, it's a weird time. So a lot of the young women, they really looked up to a fl- a pilot, and her name was Jackie Cochran. And she worked for the Women's Air Force Service during the war. And she also broke a lot of records for flight. She was like a very well-known pilot. And a lot of young women, once they saw her, they were like, wow, if she can do that, I can do that too. Like, she was known for being sort of brass balls, you know what I mean? Like, she was a real good pilot and everybody respected her. And she was also very smart. She ran businesses. I might be confused. That I might be confusing with somebody else. So scratch that. I'm not sure, but I can't quite remember. But after the war, she was like, well, we're still going to fly. So she started putting together these powder puff derbies, they were called. And she'd get all the women pilots who had helped out during the war or who she knew were pilots. And she was like, we'll do these sort of acrobatic shows and races. So the powder puff derbies, actually, I think the powder puff were more races. They were like racing each other, and all sorts of records were broken and stuff, I think, during that time. Maybe. I think that might be right. Okay, so this is Jackie Cochran. Now remember, she's somebody they're all looking up to, and she's helping getting them into the world of flying even more. Okay, so that happens. But we'll pin a note on her because she will come up again later. Okay. And then, well, let's just show you. Actually, all right, so then there was a man, and his name was Randolph Lovelace. Now, Randolph was working with Project Mercury and NASA. He was a surgeon, but he was also the head of the space. Like, they didn't know at that time what would happen if you went to space. That's why they were sending dogs and monkeys and kitty cats and all. I don't know if they sent a cat, I don't really know. But sending animals into space because they were kind of just trying to see if their heart would explode. They really didn't know what would happen. So this guy, Dr. Randolph Lovelace, was in charge of coming up with physical tests, psychological tests, like all of the testing to see if a person would be able to withstand space. And so they did very complete testing. And he was very highly regarded. So he was part of the Project Mercury testing for the men who ended up being the Mercury 7 astronauts. Now, the criteria for Project Mercury was you had to be a graduate of Navy or Air Force test pilot school. You had to have 1,500 hours, I think that's right, of flight hours. You had that many flight hours. You had to be a qualified in jet airline flying a jet aircraft. You had to have an engineering background. And you had to be, you can hardly read this, but 5'11" or less. Now, the reason for that is the capsule that you'd be in was extremely small. And if you've ever been to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., to the Air and Space Museum, you can go, I think you can sit in the capsule if I'm remembering correctly, but it is very small. So you had to be shorter, and they wanted people who were lighter weight because of, less weight for the rocket to have to send into space. So they were looking for kind of small people. Aha, that's interesting because, all right. So, Randolph Lovelace tested all these guys for physical, to see if they could, manage. And a lot did not. The only 7 made it through. And I saw an interview with some of them, and they were talking about how he said, any hole you have, they shot so much water up into it, like you can just picture which one's the worst. And everyone was laughing, and they were all the men were talking about how super difficult the tests were that Randolph Lovelace, did to them. Now, we're moving on really to the year 1960. So in 1960, Randolph has already done all the testing for the Mercury 7 men, and he, on his own, outside of NASA with private funding, I think from a jet company, but I could be wrong. But he was very good friends with Jackie Cochran, and he kind of looked up to her and was really impressed because she did like amazing stuff. And she said, hey, we got to get women ready to be astronauts. We have to get this going. We got to get this together. And Randolph was like, absolutely, let's get it. So they recruited, I think, 24 women. And they did all the same testing on them that they did on the men. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But here are the women. We have Irene Leverton, Rhea Woltman, Janet Dietrich, Wally Funk. I'm going to put her up here because I have a little story. Marion Dietrich, Jerry Cobb. Let's put her up here too. Myrtle Kagel, maybe Kagel, I don't know. Sarah Gorlick, who married and became Ratley. Jane Briggs Hart. Let's put her up here a little bit. Jean Nora Stumbow, who became Justin. Jerry Sloan. Bernice Stedman. I think they called her B. And Jean Hickston. Okay. So here are 13 women who were all pilots. And with the help of Jackie Cochran, she started helping to pick some of the pilots. And the very first one was Jerry Cobb. And Jerry Cobb went through all the testing with Lovelace. And she was the very first to complete the testing of the women. And so she helped Lovelace identify other recruits. And they did come up with, I think, 24. So Jerry Cobb was the very first one to pass through the testing. Now, part of what the testing was, they took all sorts of blood samples. They did, like where they flip you upside down. If you've ever seen the movie The Right Stuff, which if you haven't seen, it's really good. Sam Shepard's in it. And I can't remember, but it's very good. But you know the drill. Like we can all picture that montage where they're doing all these things. They do all that. But some of the ones that made me go, every day they had to have a barium enema. They took ice water and shot it into your ear, filled your ear with ice water until your eardrum freezes. So your eardrums are frozen, so you have no sense of balance and you get vertigo. And they see how long you can tolerate that, how you do with that. And if you've ever I have had vertigo. It's freaking awful, man. It's awful. It makes you feel like your eyes are twirling. It's bizarre feeling. I just the thought of that made me go, oh my God, no. And then they said they put them in a what do you call it? A deprivation tank. And I was like, oh, that's like one of those floats they have now. But I think it was well beyond that. They put them in this tank and there is no light. They have them with a floater on, and the water temperature is precisely the same as your body temperature and as the outside air temperature. I think it was Wally who described this, Wally Funk. And she said she's sitting there and realizes she can't feel her skin at all. She can't feel, and she had to like poke herself to see if she was still like there or whatever. And so they see how long you can handle being inside this deprivation tank. And one thing that Randolph Lovelace reported was that women were way more able to tolerate this for a much longer time and calm. And men would just start to be like, I gotta get out of here, I gotta get out of here, and kind of freak out about it, which is interesting. So before you go in, they ask you all these questions about your family and just all kinds of questions. And then they put you in there. You stay in as long as you can. Do you know how long Wally Funk stayed in the deprivation tank? Take a guess. She stayed in it for 10 hours, 35 minutes. And apparently at that point, Lovelace is like, well, crack it open. And she was kind of like, I'm fine. Just floating. I'm fine. Because she wanted it so badly. You know, she would do anything. She's like, I'll stay in here forever. So she beat out with all of her testing. And by the way, the women also had to undergo something beyond what men had to, which is full gynecological testing of all sorts. That was beyond what the men did, obviously. But a lot of these women were in the top, well, Wally in particular was in the top 2% out of everybody, out of all the men, all the women. She was like a top candidate. She also was, I think, I think she was in the Navy during World War II. No, that can't be right. That would be too far back. But anyway, she had like 40,000 flight hours. She flew jets with a private company, I think. That's how she had jet. Because one of the well, I'm kind of jumping ahead. But the real catch-22 of this thing is that they had these rules that women could not qualify for because women were not allowed within the U.S. military to take jet, I forget what, I think it was fighter jet training. Maybe that's what it was. There was a specific type, but they weren't allowed to do that. And maybe they weren't allowed to go to this test pilot school. But a lot of them, even when these women were told no, they were like, yeah, right, I'm doing what I want to do. They were pretty strong people. So a lot of them did fly private jet. You know, they learned it and got the training. But yeah, so it was really set up so that women could not do it. Okay. So the women make it through all of the physical regimen and the psychological testing, which they didn't go into very much, and I'm not exactly sure all of what was part of the psychological. But Lovelace said these 13 are fully qualified and possibly more qualified than the men because of some of the psychological testing they did and because they're small. They're just smaller, and that's what the government was really searching for. And they were excellent at everything they did. Well, the third part of testing, they were to show up in Florida, and that is when they'd get the phase 3 testing, and this would have been in 1961. So they had their plane tickets to Pensacola, and I heard from interviews with these women, a lot of them were under the impression they would be astronauts. If they finished the test, they would be astronauts, which wasn't exactly true. So somewhere, because up to this point, NASA doesn't even really know this whole program's going on. So much to these women's disappointment, they get a letter the day before they're to leave that basically says, NASA heard about this and they are canceling the program. They don't want it to go on. Here you can, you need to refund us for the money we gave you for flights. Like, okay, great. So the whole program was scrapped. And Vice President Johnson, I don't think he wouldn't have been president yet, but he actually signed a thing saying no women in space. I forget what the words were, but he said, I can't think of what exactly the words were, but he basically said, we're not doing it. No more women in space. We're not going to have them as part of NASA. No astronauts. So, okay, so they could have all just said, well, yet again, because we're women, we can't do something. But these women aren't ones to sit back. So then Jerry Cobb and Jane Briggs Hart, these two, decide they are going to go to Congress and make a case for women astronauts. Now, something you might want to know about Jane Briggs Hart, she was a mother of 8 children. 8. And her husband was a Michigan politician. I forget. I think he was governor of Michigan and maybe he was running for Senate or maybe he was a senator. Anyway, it doesn't really matter, but he was a politician. So she sort of had some ins with, the Senate. Sorry, my kitty cat's making noise behind me. And she said that when she was in the deprivation, no, I said that name. Hold on. When I was watching the show about it, they were talking about the deprivation tank. Sorry, hold on, Cooper. Stop. I'm sorry. I'll be right there. Hold on. My cat is getting in this bag I have over here. And it's very loud. Okay. Sorry. So she is a mother of 8. And can you imagine, as a mother of 8, if you were sent into the deprivation tank where you can just lay there in warm water and relax? I'd have been like, when I had my kids, I had 3 that were all, my oldest was 16 months when my twins were born. I would have been like, put me in the tank. Put me in, boys. I'm joking. But what she did say, somebody asked her, they said, how could you think, basically the interviewer said something along the lines like, why would you think you could be an astronaut? Don't you think you need to be home with your kids? And her response to that was, I have 2,000 hours of flight time, a job, I help my husband in politics, and we raise a family. Maybe you should ask my children how it is, because, they're perfectly happy, whatever. But it's such a pet peeve of mine that, if a man's out to get a really great job or something, nobody says to a man, well, what about your children? How are they going to get by? But women, it's always the question, And even so recently, as not that long ago, I was watching Shark Tank, and Mark Cuban is on, and I like Mark Cuban. I think he seems like a great guy. But there was a woman who was pushing her product, and he said, because you're a mom and I don't think you could run a business and take care of your kids at the same time, I'm out. And I was like, it was like getting slapped in the face. I was like, what are you doing, Mark Cuban? As a woman who has had children, raised them, and run businesses, I was offended. Anyway, but so yeah, she went through all that training and everything while also raising 8 kids, while also helping her husband be a politician. Pretty awesome. Okay, so her and Jerry Cobb who was the first woman to go through the program, they go to Congress and they're like, hey, Congress, by the way, Jackie Cochran, the only reason she wasn't part of this program herself, because she was a great pilot, is because she was too old. She was in her 50s, and I think 40 was the cutoff or something. So she was knocked out before she even started. And anyway, I don't know. Okay, let's just back up 1 second. Let's back up to so in 1961, so this program started in 1960. In 1961 is when Alan Shepard was the first American in space. Now, a cosmonaut had already been in space. Shoot, I'm going to run out of room. So he was the first man to go into like suborbit. And he wasn't, how do I say this? He wasn't piloting. It was more like when they send the dogs up, you're like in a suborbit. But he was the first American in space. About this time is when they started part 2. They'd already finished the physical tests on these women. Now they're moving into all the psychological and whatever other tests. I'm not even sure. It was a lot. But so then by 1962, that is when John Glenn, astronaut John Glenn, and I'm bringing him up because I forgot we should talk about that before we go forward. He's the first American to orbit, and it was really an untested system, so, it took a lot of courage to do that. But all the women who were still living at the time of the documentary that I watched said, oh yeah, I'd have done that. Like, I would have definitely done that. Like, because some people were like, well, no woman would have this kind of courage. But I really believe that these women would have. They did some crazy stuff. So John Glenn goes to space. I was trying to remember when I don't have it here. Well, oh yeah, okay, I know. Okay, it was 1963 that over in Russia, they send up Valentina Tereshkova. Valentina Tereshkova. Okay, so in 1963, Russia sends a woman into space. That's in 1963. And that is kind of a little bit, I think, of what maybe got Jane and Jerry going, we got to go to Congress. What are we doing? Like, how amazing would it be if stepping on the moon for the first time, you had a man and a woman, So they go to Congress and they're making their case for why women should be allowed, how well they did on all the testing, how it's completely sexist, unfair to say, well, women can't because they don't meet the requirements when they're not allowed to do the requirements. It is, women aren't allowed to do that. So you can't have that as a requirement without it being by nature a prejudiced policy. So, and by the way, about the Russians, they sent Valentina up, but then they didn't send another woman up until after Sally Ride went up in the 1980s in 83. So it was really, I don't know. Could you look at that as sort of a stunt? Maybe. I don't know. But they did send the first woman up. Okay, so now they're in Congress and they're making their case. And then they bring in some of the astronauts to testify. And John Glenn testified, and he said it's just a fact. Men go to war. I'm not directly quoting him, but this is the gist. Men go to war and they fight and they come back and they design things and they become astronauts. But again, women were flying during the war. They just weren't allowed to go fight. So it's like not quite a fair. But so that was John Glenn. But then the real shocker, the real kick in the balls, was the woman they had all looked up to and who had kind of started this whole thing, Jackie Cochran. She was, I believe she was married to a person who owned a jet company or something like that. I could be wrong. I felt like there could be some pressure from that side. But she also worked very closely with a lot of the people in Project Mercury and NASA. But she shows up at the meetings, the congressional hearings, and she says that it's not worth the money to train all these women to be astronauts because you'll just lose them through marriage. And basically argued against women being astronauts. And that was sort of a nail in the coffin for these women. And obviously they were shocked and very upset about it. And according to the son of one of these women, and I don't remember who it was, he said later in life, Jackie was talking to him and was very remorseful about doing that. And she had felt a lot of pressure from NASA because I don't even know, because it might start to stop the program. I don't even know why. I don't know why. But so after the congressional hearing, that is when Vice President Johnson canceled the program. And he actually wrote in a letter, "Stop this now." So that was the end of that. And that was the end of it for a long time. In fact, this was 1962-63, and it wasn't, this is actually kind of a shocking fact. Hold on. And by the way, Lovelace always believed the women were equally as qualified. It wasn't until the year 1978 that NASA started to admit women to the astronaut corps program. 1978. So in 1983, that is when Sally Ride was the first American woman in space. And she was, I don't know how to say it, a member of the crew. But then in 1995, that is when Eileen Collins, there's only one L, Eileen Collins, was the first female pilot in space on one of the space shuttle missions. And in case you were wondering, all of the Mercury 7 were white men, and all of the astronauts were white men until in 1983, I think Sally Ride and, Guion Bluford, he was a black guy, a person of color, I don't know, what do we say? And then in 1985, Frederick Gregory was a pilot who was, I think, a black guy. I hope that doesn't sound racist. I don't know what is. It's funny. I actually don't know. I don't know what the like. When I was young, you'd say a black person, and then it was African American. But I always felt weird about that because not everybody would necessarily qualify as. And so now I think black person's okay. But then I hear person of color, which at first seemed crazy because in the very old days, people would say colored people, that's bad. And so if I am saying anything wrong, I genuinely don't mean to. I'm just lost in terminology sometimes. And I'm being very honest with you by telling you that, so don't get mad at me. Okay. So anyway, yeah, Eileen Collins in 1995 was the first woman to pilot. So that's just a fascinating story, right? Like, I had never even known about this whole group. You know, the other thing is, though, some of these women went on to, like, oh, I know. Okay, here's one. So there was another NASA guy, Gordon Cooper. And there's a clip of Gordon Cooper after the hearings who said, and he says, and people are like, well, the Russians put a woman in space. Why don't the Americans? And he said, well, we could have put a woman in space, some type of woman instead of a chimpanzee. And what was wild about that moment is he says this in front of a crowd, and the crowd cracks up laughing. But I swear to you, the look on his face, he was just like, no, like really, it didn't matter to me if it was a chimpanzee or a woman. But he couldn't think of them as pilots, as actual like equals. It's like she's kind of the same as a chimpanzee in my mind, is how I think that was his honest point of view. And just hearing that made some of these women, and there was one in particular, but I can't remember. I feel like it was Jerry, go, and she became, I think it was her, shoot, I wish I knew for sure, but super active in NOW, which is the National Organization of Women, and fought for women's rights, for just equal opportunities in all things. But I think her, specialty was always this. But these kind of women doing this and the fights that they, fought for women in the 60s is really what got Eileen Collins to be a pilot in the 90s. And right before Eileen got on the space shuttle, she made a speech and said, if it weren't for the Mercury 13, I wouldn't be here, doing this. And she invited them all personally, all the ones who were still alive, which a lot of them lived to be, by the way, they had like 500 million x-rays done during the testing. And I was like, oh no, they're all going to get cancer. But no, almost all of these women, like 10 of them, lived to be almost 90 or over 90. Like, really amazing. But anyway, Eileen Collins invited them all. And when NASA heard that she had invited them all, they said, no, we're going to give them VIP tickets. So NASA has definitely come around on the whole women in STEM and everything. They have definitely changed. So it was pretty cool. They all got to be at that flight. Oh, but maybe even more interesting, Wally. I think it was Wally. Now I'm worried it's not. It was a Jerry or Wally. Hold on, let me think. I think it was Wally. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so Wally got to, in like 20, I feel like it was like 2016 or something, she got to go on a Blue Origin flight. And up until that moment, the other pilot, John Glenn, had been the oldest person in space. Well, Wally went, and at 82, she knocked him out for the oldest person in space, which I'm sure was a little bit of a like, yes, because he had been pretty against the women in space thing. So for a while anyway, she was the oldest person in space. I don't know if that's still holding or not, but she rode on a Blue Origin. So she is the only one of the 13 who made it to space. But that's pretty exciting. Trying to think what else. Oh, shoot. Sorry, I hit the thing with this. This is a moon globe, a little moon. But really they've sent a lot of, NASA has spacecrafts to space. And like the first Apollo mission, there was a fire. And unfortunately, I think 3 of the astronauts died, if I remember correctly. And then Apollo 13 got in that's one the movie about where they had to go around the moon and slingshot back or whatever. And then there was a Challenger shuttle that blew up on takeoff that I remember very clearly watching in high school. And then a Columbia shuttle exploded on re-entry. It got too hot, I think. And that sounds like a lot, but really they've sent so many missions into space. It's not a bad record, really. And the amount that they did during that space race, it was just so much discovery and just doing things to try to beat Russia to it. But and we did actually beat Russia to the moon eventually. My mom was at a dinner recently, and she was telling me that there was a man there who worked as an engineer on the original space missions. And he had so many interesting stories. Like, oh, I wish I'd been there. That would be so interesting to hear those kind of stories. Somebody should record people like that who won't be around forever and get all the stories, Just unbelievable how much engineering and, really danger there was in it because they just didn't know. It was such an unknown. It's very exciting. Anyway, I'm sure there's a million other things I could tell you, but I can't think of anything else. Yeah, so Jackie Cochran kind of disappointed a lot of people. But like I said, apparently later in life, she said she really regretted what she had done there. It's original 13. And to be clear, it wasn't just men who thought women weren't ready for space. It was a different time. I can't even tell you how different of a time if you haven't been there. There were plenty of women who were like, oh no, women shouldn't do that or couldn't do that, or it was really different. So I'm just sitting here thinking if there's anything else to tell you about it. I'm sure there is. Like I said, there is a documentary. I couldn't really find a great podcast about it. I know the one woman, she said, space shouldn't be a stag club. Oh, that was kind of funny. like them. And it is interesting that, all these women, like multiple of them that they interviewed, talked about, seeing Jackie Cochran when they were younger. And that's part of what gave them, like, the idea or the permission or the feeling that they could fly. And I'm sure Amelia Earhart and things like that. But that's why it's so important in the world to have women do things, or people of color do things, because then other people can look at them and go, oh, if they can do that, I can do that. And I think, and I have a family full of white men. I love my white guys. But I know it's hard sometimes to hear it if you're a white guy, but it is a world where almost everyone in power looks the same. And it's hard to sometimes picture yourself in that level of power or that position if you've never seen anyone like you in that position. Do you know what I mean? And that's the feeling with that. If you're it does help, for young women and to see people. I think I told you guys before, but my grandma graduated with a business degree from Harvard University. Well, that's what she should have graduated with. But Harvard would not give a business degree to women. So even though that's what all her classes were, and that's what she graduated and paid for, they made her get a degree from, oh shoot, what's the school next door, like right by, there's a women's school right by Harvard. Anyway, an education degree. Is it Radford? I think it's Radford. I'm forgetting the name, but the women's school right by. And that's what she was allowed to get. So, And my mom was, well, she was the associate dean of a law school. And there was a club that a lot of the professors, who were all men, not so much at this time, there were some women, but would go to. And she was like, well, I'm going to go and see what's going on. But it was a men's club, so she was not allowed in. And that was in the 1980s. So these things are real.